Hi everybody. In this video, we're not going to cover any new topics. This is a video combining most of what we have learned before. It will combine the big topics we have learned, namely loops, if statements, and lists. So what I'm going to do in this video is write a single program for you and model sort of the programming process when we are writing a sophisticated program. So the program that I will write for you in this video is the casino game Craps. We're going to write a program that lets a user play that game. It's a sophisticated program. It combines these three topics in a non-trivial way. So I want to model for you, again, what it's like to sketch out a schematic for a program. I want to show you the pseudocode approach. Like before we code, let's talk through what the code will look like. And then I want to show you how these three big tools interact with each other inside of a sophisticated program. So the main reason I want to make a video like this, where there's nothing new to learn, right? There's no new topics or material. It's just a combination of old material. The main reason I want to show you this is because much of programming, especially at the beginner level, involves not so much gaining knowledge or gaining a bunch of facts. You know, it's not learning a bunch of facts. It's learning a small amount of tools, which is what loops and lists are. These are tools. Learning a small amount of tools and then learning how the combination of those tools can do really powerful things. So it's more about building a toolkit, and then as you write more and more code, as you write bigger and better programs, you just learn more and more what all these tools can do for you. So beginning programming is kind of like being trained as a handyman, if you like. Okay, so when I call a handyman to my house, he shows up with like a little toolbox with a hammer and a wrench or whatever. And the handyman, because of his training and because of all of his practice, can do all sorts of sophisticated things with those tools that I cannot do because I'm not handy, right? So the handyman, it's not like he necessarily knows a ton of facts about hammers or whatever, right? It's just that he's learned to be really creative and really sophisticated with these tools that he has. With this limited set of tools, he can do all sorts of amazing things around my house that I pay him very good money for because I don't know how to do them myself. So the same thing here, okay? So a loop, an if statement, a list, these are tools that can be used to create really sophisticated things. So we're starting to see some of their power as we move through the course. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to write a single program that unifies most of the material we have seen so far. So we're going to write a program that lets the user play Craps. This is a popular casino dice game. I'm just going to code one version of this game. There are multiple versions of this game. You can play at different casinos, but these rules I'm giving are just for sort of a standard stripped down version. You can play this version at the Argosy on the riverfront if you want to. Anyway, so here's how it goes. Gameplay comes in phases. So in phase 1, the player rolls 2 dice. And before rolling, the player decides on a bet. They bet pass or don't pass. Okay, so if the player rolls a 2, 3, or 12, that means the 2 dice sum to a 2, sum to a 3, sum to a 12. Okay, so if the player rolls 2 sixes, right, that counts as a 12. Okay, so if the player rolls a sum of 2, 3, or 12 on this first roll, the game is over, and the player either won or lost. If the player bet pass, then the player loses. Okay, so if the player bets pass, that player is betting none of these three show up. Okay. Anyway, if the player bets don't pass, then the player wins for outcomes are 2 or 3, but ties for 12. Okay, so it's a little confusing here, but if you bet don't pass and you roll a 12, the casino will just give you your bet back, basically. Like you neither win nor lose money, but you win on a 2 or 3. Okay, so if you bet don't pass and you roll a sum of 2 or 3, you will get some money off of that. If the first roll is a 7 or 11, the pass bet wins and don't pass bet loses. Okay, so basically, if you roll a 2, 3, 12, 7, or 11 on your first roll, the game is just done. And you either win, lose, or tie depending on how you decided to bet. So if you bet pass, right, that was your bet, you're hoping a 7 or 11 shows up on this roll. If you bet don't pass, then you're hoping a 2 or 3, or I guess maybe a 12 shows up on that roll. Okay, so that's how gameplay starts. You roll the 2 dice. You roll either a 2, 3, 12, 7, or 11. And depending on that, you win or lose. Okay, but what if you roll something else? What if you roll a 4, 5, 8, whatever, right? Well, if the first dice roll is not a 2, 3, 7, 11, 12, it's a 4, 5, whatever, then this first roll becomes what's called the point, and the game is now not over. The game continues into a second phase. And now what the player is going to do is they're going to roll the 2 dice until they get a 7, in which case the game is over, but the player loses. Or the player rolls the point, in which case the player wins. Okay, so this second phase could go on for a while, because you could roll like you could roll a 2, then a 12, then an 11, then a 9, then whatever, right? You just keep rolling, but you're going to keep rolling until you get a 7, or until you get your point, which again was your first roll. So just as an example here of how this goes, suppose the player bets pass. If the player rolls a 2, 3, or 12 on the first roll, the game is over, the player loses. If the player rolls a 7 or 11 on the first roll, the player wins, the game is over, right? Okay, suppose the player rolls a 5 on the first roll. Now, since 5 is in this list of numbers, right, the game will keep going. We now go into phase 2, where the player keeps rolling until she gets a 7 and loses, or rolls a 5 and wins. So this pass, don't pass thing only applies to the first roll. If you roll any of these 6 numbers on your first roll, you just move on to phase 2. Whichever of these 6 numbers you rolled is your point, and you're now trying to roll that again. If you can roll it again, you win, before rolling a 7. So let's write a program that lets the user play this game. And I'm going to use a list to record the dice rolls in the game. So I'm going to create a record of the game, essentially, right? I'm going to create a record of all of the rolls, and I'm going to use a list to do that. Before I write the code, or before I show you the code, okay, so the code is on Moodle, so you can just follow along with it. Let's do some pseudocode sketching here. Let's think about what this program should look like. Because again, if you just sit down to start trying to code this, it might take you a lot longer to do than if you do some pre-coding planning to think about your strategy. Okay, so clearly we have to start by getting pass or don't pass from the user. Then we got to roll 2 dice and see what that first roll is. Now, depending on what that first roll is, we have to do some stuff, right? So we'll set up an if, else structure as follows. Well, if the roll was 2, 3, or 12, that's sort of one case, right? You can check win or loss. If the roll was 7 or 11, that's like a second case of what could happen, right? So in either of those 2 cases, we have to check what their bet was. But 2, 3, 12, 7, 11, those are all game terminating cases, right? The game is just over. So you check whether or not the player bet pass or don't pass and see if they won, lost, or tied. Okay, so that's if, right? If 2, 3, or 12, then do something. Otherwise, if 7, 11, do basically the same thing, right? But the pass and don't pass are going to have to be dealt with separately. The else now, right? Else is, oh, so you didn't roll a 2, 3, 12, you didn't roll 7, 11. Well, now we got to do phase 2. So if deals with 2, 3, 12, else if deals with 7, 11, else deals with everything else, 4, 5, 6, 8, whatever. Okay, so in this else part of the code, where we're dealing with phase 2, well, now we have to set up a loop, right? Because in phase 2, you're going to keep rolling until you reach the point or a 7. And as we've talked about before, anytime you use the English word until, or you use the English word as a phrase as long as, anytime you do that, you're talking about a loop. We need to just keep rolling dice over and over again until we reach a 7 or we reach your point, right? So at the end of phase 2, once that has happened, I'm going to print all the relevant data like, hey, did you win or lose? And what do the dice rolls do, right? Show me a record of the dice rolls. So you can see from this pre-coding planning where the ifs, else's, and lists come in, right? Or loops, where all that comes in. So there's nothing fancy here, right? First two steps, there's no if, no loop, whatever. The global structure of the program is an if structure, right? And then within that if structure, inside of this else in phase 2, that's where a loop is going to show up. So you're going to have a loop inside of an if structure. And embedded through all that, you're going to have this list being built. Every time you roll the dice, you're going to have to record that dice roll by adding to a list. Okay, but anyway, again, you can see from this pre-coding planning where the loops and ifs are going to be and what their relationship to each other are. That's why it's useful to do this up front. Okay, so let's just look at the code. For the sake of time, I'm not going to write it all. So this is on Moodle, so you can follow along on your own computer if you want to. So let's just talk through this quickly. Well, first I got to import random because I'm going to be rolling dice. My first step here is to get the user's bet. So I have them enter 1 for pass or 2 for don't pass. So again, you can have them tell you this information however you feel like. I just decided to do 1 and 2. I roll my first 2 dice. This is my first roll at the table. Okay, I then create an empty list of rolls. I don't have any rolls yet to put in there. And here's my sum. Okay, so I've rolled my 2 dice. I've recorded their sum, and notice right here, I put that sum inside of the list of rolls. So at this point in the code, right, what is all this doing right here? This blue highlighted stuff is rolling the 2 dice, recording their sum, and then like recording it in a variable, and also recording it in this list of rolls. So I have a record going of the first roll. And I tell the user what happened, right? Your first roll is whatever, and I tell them what it is. Now, right, if the sum is a 2, or the sum is a 3, or the sum is a 12, that's the first case. If they bet 1, which, let me scroll back up, 1 was pass, okay? If the sum is a 2, 3, or 12, a pass bet is a loss. Let's see. What is a 2? Oh yeah, don't pass, right? Otherwise, if bet is 2 and the sum is 12, that's a tie, right? So if you said don't pass, right? So you're betting not pass, and you rolled a 12. Remember, that was the tie outcome. So that's all that's happening here, right? You can say push or you can say tie, whatever. Otherwise, you won, right? The last little catch-all case here is that you bet a 2 and you bet one of these other 2 guys. Your bet was 2 and the sum was 2. Your bet was 2 and your sum was 3. Those are win outcomes for you. Okay, so that covers the case of the first roll being a 2, 3, or 12. You win or lose based on your pass or don't pass bet. Otherwise, if the sum is a 7 or 11, if your bet was 1, now you win, notice, right? So what was 1? 1 was pass. If bet was 1, you win. Otherwise, you lose. Okay, so that covers just your first roll terminating the game. So if 2, 3, or 12, game's over. You either win or lose based on your bet. Otherwise, if 7 or 11, you win or lose based on your bet. Otherwise, right, if you didn't roll the 7, 11, 2, 3, 12, now you got to do phase 2. So now point is sum, right? So that first dice roll, sum is way back up here, right? That first dice roll now becomes your point. And now I say, hey, phase 2, roll 2 dice, record the sum. Add that sum to the list of rolls to create a record, right? And as long as that sum's not 7 and the sum's not point, then I got to keep doing the same thing over and over again, right? Roll the 2 dice, record the sum, right? As long as I have not reached the 7 and I also have not reached my point, so I'm rolling other things besides those 2, I got to keep re-rolling the dice and then making a record of what I've done. So these commands here, right, these rolls.append, that is just taking every time I roll the dice, recording that in the list of rolls. Once that loop is done, okay, the only way this loop ends is if you roll a 7 or your point, right? That's how you break out of it. So once that loop is done, I know the game is over. Here's a complete record of your rolls, print the rolls. If that sum now is 7, right? If my final sum was 7, I lost because I rolled a 7. Otherwise, I won because I rolled my point. Okay, so let's just run this and see if it works properly. I'm going to do the pass bet. Oh man, I lost up front. First roll was 7, and I lost because I bet pass. Okay, so let's play it again. 1 for pass, 2 for don't pass. My first roll is a 9. Okay, so a 9 means that the game continues. I go to phase 2. 9 is now my point. And then notice it tells me, here's a complete record of your rolls. I rolled the 9, and then this is all phase 2. Right? 4, 6, 8, 5, 5, 5, 11, 5, 6. 7. I rolled a 7 before I rolled a 9, before rolling my point, so I lost. Let's play one more time maybe. I'll bet pass again. My first roll is a 4, so I go to phase 2, right? Again, here's what I do in phase 2. I'm trying to get a 4 before 7, but I rolled a 7 before 4, so I lost. So generally speaking, going to phase 2 is kind of bad for you because 7 is the most likely thing to roll. So if you're in phase 2, the odds are against you. You know, it's more likely to roll a 7 than a 4. Let's try one more time. See if I can get something different to happen. Well, same thing, right? So I rolled an 8, which means I go into phase 2. Here's the record. I rolled a 7 pretty quickly there. So anyway, it appears to be working, right? So that's nice. Okay, so again, here's what I consider a sophisticated program. Not because it involves a ton of code, right? There's not like a ton of code here, right? If you printed this off, this would be like a page of code, maybe a page and a half. But what's sophisticated here is the logic, right? The idea that you have to use ifs, elses, loops, and lists in this way, in this combination, right? That takes some getting used to. Much like a handyman who has to fix my whatever, a cabinet or something in my house, right, has to know how to use all of his tools in concert to achieve some desired outcome. And he knows how to do that far better than I do because he's had practice, right? So anyway, writing programs like this is how you learn to code, right? You have to write programs like this over and over again to get comfortable with all these tools and how to use them in concert. So hopefully after watching this video, you are more comfortable doing that and you'll have some practice in class, of course.